I'm going to show you what I think is one of the craziest moments in true crime that's ever been caught on film. So this is Chris Watts, and in this video, he's showing the cops video footage that his neighbor collected of Chris's house the night that his pregnant wife Shanann and 2 daughters went missing. If he's looking at footage that might potentially help solve this case, though, why does he look so nervous? So what the cops who caught this video don't know yet is that Chris is responsible for the deaths of his pregnant wife and 2 daughters. And as he's talking to the cops, you can see him huffing and puffing. He is so nervous that he's about to get caught in this moment. And then watch what happens the second Chris leaves and it's just the cops and his neighbor. Chris's neighbor and friend starts tipping the cops off to the fact that something is not right with Chris.
I've never seen him. If he loads his stuff, he normally just walks back and forth because I get him on camera.
The neighbor's basically telling the police that Chris does sometimes load stuff into his truck for work, but the night that his family went missing, he parks his truck inside of the garage, which he never does, and is loading stuff in because he knows that his neighbor has security cameras. It's just so heartbreaking because Chris is still pretending in this video that his family up and left on their own accord that night. I think about this true crime case every year around the holidays. On Christmas Eve 1945, the Sauter family house burned down in West Virginia, and only 4 of the 9 children home that night made it out. The cops told the parents that all 5 children must have died in the fire that night, but when they did a search of the area the next day, no remains were found. Absolutely no evidence of the kids being in the house was found. So then fast forward a year, and the dad sees a photo in a magazine of a little girl in New York who looks identical to his daughter Betty. But then the authorities in town are like, "You're crazy, there's no way all the kids died in the fire that night." And then a little while after that, the authorities actually get in trouble for planting evidence in the rubble saying that the kids died in the fire. And then fast forward another 20 years, and the parents actually get a letter in the mail with this photo claiming to be their son Lewis, but are never able to find any more information about who this is. There's so many more twists and turns to this story, and I actually do a full breakdown in my most recent podcast episode. But if you know the case, what do you think? Did the kids really die in the fire that night? I'm going to show you another one of the craziest true crime moments ever caught on camera. So in 2011, Laura Giddings went missing at Mercer University, and closely watched this concerned classmate talk to a reporter.
No one has seen her since Saturday. The last time anyone heard from her was an email that she sent out, and no one's heard from her since.
That man is Stephen McDaniel, and he is responsible for her murder. But the craziest part is at this point, she's still missing. So watch what happens when the reporter tells him live on TV that the body was found.
What about in the parking lot area? I know they've been doing a lot of, I think that's where they have recovered the body or whatever they recovered from there.
Body?
Are you okay, sir?
I think I need to sit down.
Okay.
Early that Sunday morning, he had gone into her apartment with a master key that he stole for the building and murdered her. And currently, he's up for parole in 2041. One of the worst serial killers of all time is being released from prison. He goes by the name of the Serpent, and he's been linked to 20 murders of Western tourists all throughout Asia and the Middle East. Most of these attacks took place on the hippie trail, where he would lure in tourists by pretending to be a spiritual guru and then poison them. Some of his victims he would actually poison and then nurse back to health because he thought that it made them loyal to him. One time in 1976, he attempted to drug a group of 60 French students who were on holiday in New Delhi so that he could rob them. But he gave them too powerful of a dose, and they all started passing out while standing up. Authorities caught on to this, and he was arrested, where he was then linked to the murders of 20 other people. And he is currently being released from prison on good behavior and because of his old age. And we've seen this before with repeat killers, where they just stop killing while they're in prison and then start killing the second they get out. Okay, so this is kind of a weird thing that's happening, but the head of Scientology, David Miscavige, is reportedly missing. He's currently under investigation for child trafficking, and lawyers have tried to serve him 27 times in the last 4 months, but no one knows where he is. The charges come from 3 victims who claim that Miscavige forced them to work on boats as children after they were also forced to sign a $1 billion contract. In Scientology, they consider you to be an adult at 6 years old. One of the victims also claimed that after her mother left Scientology, the victim was forced to stay in a closet for 48 hours. All of this, of course, also comes after Shelley Miscavige, David's wife, has not been seen since 2007, even though recently it's been reported that she might be living in Big Bear, California. As you've probably already heard, an arrest has been made in the Idaho stabbing case. But now some really interesting information is coming out about the way the police caught who they believe the killer is. So pretty quickly after the tragedy, police were looking for this white Hyundai Elantra. It was seen near the crime scene as the tragedy was happening, but then it was also caught on a security camera speeding away right afterwards. And what car was found at Bryan Kohberger's house in Pennsylvania? A white Hyundai Elantra. But police had been tracking this car for 4 days when they caught Bryan. Apparently, Bryan's father had flown out to Washington to meet him, and they drove the car home to Pennsylvania together. Up until this point, we didn't know at what point the police believed that Bryan was a suspect, but now we know that they had been tracking his trip cross country. And prior to this, police had actually gotten a genealogical DNA hit that matched Bryan's DNA to the crime scene. What this basically means is police collected all of the DNA that was found at the crime scene and put it through DNA sequencing that takes a long time, and were able to match most of the DNA to the 4 victims. But there was also DNA there that didn't make any sense. And when it was put through the genealogical sequencing, they got a hit on one of Bryan's relatives. Pair that with the fact that when they went to check on him, he was driving the white Elantra cross country to his parents' house, and voila. Have you guys seen these 2023 predictions that were made 100 years ago? Some of them are hysterical, but some of them are like eerily accurate. The first one just says no more hard work by 2023, and it says that we're not going to work more than 4 hours a day because of electricity. It also says that every city will be a spotless town. But oh no, this one says we should worry, because men will be wearing curls and women will be shaving their heads. Which, this is the least of my concerns in the world we've created for ourselves. And then this one really doubles down on the curls for men. This one got really close, so it tried to predict our population in 2023 at 300 million people. And as of July 1st, 2022, we were at 333 million. This was a really ambitious one because flying had just been invented, but it said you'd be able to fly from Chicago to Hamburg in 18 hours. And we actually figured out how to do it in half that time. This one was kind of spooky because it says that people will not begin the day by reading the world's news, but by listening to it. I don't know if they predicted that NPR was going to have a whole podcasting arm, but that one is very accurate. And then this one has been freaking a lot of people out because it says watch-size radio telephones will keep everybody in communication with the end of the earth. In the early 1920s, you couldn't even dial phone numbers. You had to be connected to an operator every time you picked up the phone. So the fact that they predicted that we would have small phones that also broadcasted radio and talk on them, and we could call anywhere in the world, is like kind of amazing. Alice remembered passing 3-year-old Mary Edens out of a window. But when Alice escaped the burning building herself, Mary was nowhere to be found. On Christmas Eve 1924, 200 people in Oklahoma crammed into this one-story schoolhouse for a Christmas Eve program. But as the program was ending, the Christmas tree got knocked over and the candles on it caused the entire school to erupt in flame. A woman named Alice was there holding her 3-year-old niece Mary Edens. The last thing she remembered before passing out from smoke inhalation was passing Mary through the window to a stranger on the other end. But when Alice awoke, she learned the news that no one had seen Mary since the fire. Not only that, but everyone who had died in the fire was accounted for, and Mary was the only person missing from the event. So where did she go? Well, 30 years later, a woman shows up to Mary's parents' house claiming to be Mary. And while Mary's parents accepted her as their child, some people in the community started thinking something was wrong. This whole story is crazy, and I cover the whole thing on my podcast. Give it a listen and let me know your theories. These serial killers got caught because of stupid mistakes they made. And I cover all sorts of true crime and spooky stuff here, so make sure you follow along. Dennis Rader was a prolific serial killer in Kansas from 1974 to 1991. He was called BTK, which stood for Bind, Torture, Kill, because that's what he liked to do. But he also liked to taunt the police. He would send the police letters signed BTK, which could not be traced back to his real identity. So in the early 2000s, he had been dormant for over 10 years, but he still liked to taunt the police. And the early 2000s also brought new technology for communicating. So BTK, being the mad genius he was, wrote a letter to police asking if he sent them a floppy disk, would they be able to trace it back to him? And the police answered this letter basically saying, no, we totally can't do that. So BTK sends the police a floppy disk, and there is metadata on this floppy disk that says the last edit was done by someone named Dennis at Christ Lutheran Church. And then a 10-second Google search showed police that Dennis Rader was the president of the council at Christ Lutheran Church. Afterwards, the police basically came out and said that if Dennis had just kept his mouth shut and kept murdering, they probably would have never caught him. Let me know if you want more of these, because there's some other idiots out there. These are serial killers that got caught for being idiots. And yes, this is a series, so make sure you follow along. This is David Berkowitz, also known as the Son of Sam. He's best known for being the serial unaliver who believed that his neighbor's dog was telling him to commit the crimes. And he was really hard to catch. His attacks felt random and lacked pattern, other than the fact that a lot of his victims were women with long brown hair. But the thing that did this man in was that he parked illegally while committing one of the crimes. Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog one night when she saw a car being ticketed. And then out of nowhere, she sees this figure come towards her with what looks like a gun in his hand. She freaks out and runs away, but hears 2 gunshots get fired behind her. The next day, she learns that 2 people, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, had been shot in that area. So she calls the police and tells them everything she saw that night. The man with the gun, hearing the gunshots, and seeing the car with the ticket. And the cops did a real quick search through their database and found that the car had been registered to Berkowitz, who was already on their radar. And the second they went to question him about it, he confessed to everything. If you're in Pittsburgh and you hear a mysterious recording of a baby crying or a child calling for help, lock your door. I have like 5 minutes to do my makeup. So more and more people in Pittsburgh are complaining about hearing babies crying outside of their windows at night, as was the case with Olivia Bennington last week. Her sister claimed that Olivia would wake up every night at 3 a.m. claiming that there was a baby wailing outside of her window. But her sister never heard anything and honestly felt like Olivia was going crazy. Then one day, Olivia's sister came home to find Olivia packing an overnight bag. Olivia said she had to leave. There was something outside of her window tormenting her. If it wasn't a baby, then she had no idea what it was, but it felt like it was something evil. Olivia couldn't stop her sister from leaving. And she's the 5th person this month to go missing after having similar complaints. Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? I'm going to show you some sketches, then I'm going to show you the person that was caught, and we're going to see. And I cover all things spooky on this channel, so make sure you follow along. So this photo right here is a police sketch of the original Night Stalker, also known as the Golden State Killer. The Golden State Killer is known for terrorizing California in the 70s and 80s. So it took a really long time for them to be able to catch the Golden State Killer, and part of the reason is they thought that he was 2 different killers at first. They thought it was one person who was responsible for a bunch of SAs that were happening in Northern California, and then a separate person that years later was responsible for taking people's lives. But DNA evidence proved that it was one man, and these are some sketches of him. One thing that really stands out to me is this like all-American kind of boy next door look that he almost has. In 2018, DNA evidence proved that it was Joseph DeAngelo who was the Golden State Killer, but let's look at some pictures of him when he was younger. The other photos to me don't look as similar, but this is spot on to me. There's so many little details in this photo that are correct, from the swoopy hair to the chubby cheeks and the thin lips. Like even the ears look identical. And you'll notice here that he is in a cop uniform because he was a cop, which is something that they figured because of the nature of his crimes. One thing that he would do to victims was he would wake them up by shining a flashlight into their eyes, which is something that the police would use to disorient people that they were arresting. Ultimately, it was DNA evidence from a genealogical database that put him away, but I'm a little bit surprised they didn't catch him based on the sketch because it looks so similar to me. Welcome to another installation of Killers That Got Caught Because They're Idiots. Today we're talking about the guy that tried to kidnap a barista in Washington on Monday. And while he's not a killer and it's unclear if that was his intention, he's still an idiot, so he's on the list. In this video, you can see here where Matthew Darnell tried to kidnap a barista by pulling her through the small drive-through window. It's unclear why he thought that would work, but thank God it was his plan because the barista was basically uninjured in the whole ordeal. Let's now take a look at this large and identifiable tattoo that says Chevrolet in cursive that ultimately helped the police identify Matthew. I'm not here to tattoo shame anyone, but maybe don't commit a crime where the only 2 parts of you caught on security footage are your face and a hyper-specific tattoo that is unique to you. Also, as he's leaving, he stops here, and I don't know if that's to collect the $5 in loose change that she dropped. But as he's leaving, we get a really great glimpse of the back of his truck and his license plate, which also helped the police identify him. Matthew is currently being held on a $500,000 bail, but let's hope he never gets out. Killers That Got Caught for Being Stupid, Part 3. And this is a series I've been doing, so make sure you follow along. I just felt like I had to make this video, but we're going to talk about this guy right here. I remember when the Idaho tragedy first happened, there was this idea going around online that some criminal mastermind had done this, that it was a serial offender that was never going to get caught. When in reality, no, it was just done by this dumbass. And you could tell that he thinks he's the smartest guy ever, but we're here to knock him down a peg. For one, Brian had his phone on him the entire time he was casing the house leading up to the crime and for most of the night he committed the crime. And when the cops got his phone records, he literally drew a map of him driving straight to the crime scene that night. And the reason the cops had enough evidence to grab his phone records was He left part of the weapon he used in the house that night in a room that he locked behind him. So even if he did realize he had left it there was no way for him to retrieve it. And he walked straight past one of the surviving roommates, somehow without seeing her, and she was able to give an exact description of him to the police. And the police went to go question Brian because they knew he drove a white Elantra, but the first thing they noticed was that he had the bushy eyebrows that the roommate described the person in the house having. So the next time you see his stupid photo and hear, oh, he was a PhD student, he was learning how to commit the perfect crime, no. This is why these old cathedrals freak me out. So in Loudun, France in the 1600s, there was this cathedral. And one day, all of the nuns that worked there were complaining about having the same nightmare. All of them were seeing this shadowy figure that they referred to as the Cloth Man. He would appear angelic at first, but then would quickly turn demonic. This was terrifying the nuns, but it started getting so much worse. See, after these nightmares started happening, the nuns started showing symptoms of demonic possession. Mass hysteria broke out, and some of the nuns were able to bend over backwards so their shoulders were touching their ankles. It was also said that others were caught levitating. But these nuns thought they knew who was doing this to them. The head priest at this cathedral was a man by the name of Father Grandier, and he was accused of practicing black magic. He was eventually burned at the stake, but they were not able to exorcise the demons out of the nuns. And in fact, many of the men who tried to perform exorcisms suffered horrible fates, even claiming that Grandier's ghost was tormenting them from beyond the grave. Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? I'm going to show you a sketch, then the person, and we're going to see. And this is part of a series, so make sure you follow along. This is the Unabomber, probably the most famous police sketch ever drawn. And this is what was seen in 1987 by the only woman to ever see him in action. He'd go on to mail 16 bombs across the country over the course of 18 years. And this is a picture of a young Ted Kaczynski, the man that did it. The Unabomber was incredibly hard to catch because he lived in this shed and was a total recluse. It was actually his brother's wife that suggested that Ted was the Unabomber because she recognized his writing style in a letter that he had written to authorities. Thank God for observant women, and let me know if there's anyone else you want to see. Working overnight at a hospital sounds terrifying. A few years ago, a woman was working an overnight shift in the dementia ward of a hospital. And she went to go check in on one of her patients who had aphasia, which means that she couldn't speak. But it seemed like the older woman was trying to communicate something to the nurse. And the nurse got a really bad vibe. She's like, okay, something's clearly wrong here. When all of a sudden the woman with aphasia starts shaking, she looks terrified and she points at something behind the nurse. But when the nurse turned around, there was nothing behind her. The nurse is terrified, but she finishes her shift. She has to clock out downstairs in the basement of the hospital, and it's like 3 a.m. at this point. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, she hears this clanging noise. So she peers around the corner into the hallway, and there's just a knife laying in the middle of the hallway. No explanation. I actually shared this scary story and a bunch of other hospital-related scary stories in this week's episode of the podcast. Have you ever wondered how accurate police sketches are? I'm going to show you someone who committed a crime and then a sketch, and we're going to see. And this is a series, so follow along for more. So in 1971, John List annihilated his entire family. John had recently lost his job, but for a while he was pretending that he still had a job. He would leave his house in the mornings, but would spend the whole day just reading and not being at work. He knew his family would eventually catch on, so on November 9th, very slowly and methodically, one by one, he took the lives of his mother, his wife, and all 3 of his children. And then he disappeared to start a new life. That is, until 18 years later, when Frank Bender, a police sketch artist, debuted this clay bust of what he thought John would look like at this time on America's Most Wanted. He age progressed John 18 years from the last time he had been seen, and he even got his glasses right. The bust was so accurate that a man named Robert Clark would be arrested in Denver because his neighbors called in a tip to the FBI. John had been living under that name for 18 years. Do you remember the story of the adult woman who was pretending to be a child in order to get adopted? Well, the story is so much crazier than that. In 2010, the Barnett family adopted Natalia Grace, a 6-year-old girl from Ukraine. But shortly after the adoption, the family claimed that Natalia wasn't who she said she was. She couldn't speak any Ukrainian, which the family thought was weird, but she was also showing signs of being post-puberty, meaning she probably wasn't 6 years old. So the parents got a bone density test done on her, and the doctor said that she was at least 14, if not older. And on top of that, her behavior was starting to become menacing. She would stand over the parents' beds at night saying she was just waiting for the right time, and she threatened violence against the 3 other sons. One time she even tried to poison the mother. But what do the parents do? They get her age legally changed to 22 years old, rent her an apartment, and leave her in it by herself. They thought they were escaping a murderer, but many believe that they abandoned a disabled child. There's so many twists and turns to this story, and I do a whole deep dive on my podcast this week. When I was 5, I was groomed by a future murderer. My family and I had a caravan in a holiday park in New South Wales. We would go there every school holiday, and I have a lot of fond memories of this place. But other memories are not as good. The people who owned the caravan park had a son, and he was about 25 years old. He would drive around the park and collect everyone's trash in a tractor and do other odd jobs to help out around the park. Every once in a while, he would pull up when I was playing out front and ask if I wanted a ride on the tractor. Of course, I said yes, but this was also back in the day where parents would let kids just play in the street with no supervision. So one day, he dropped me off back at our van, and my dad comes storming out, yanks me by the arm off the tractor, and pulls me inside. And he screams at me saying, "You are never allowed to hang out with that boy ever again." And I start crying and I'm saying, "He's nice, he gives me lollipops." I couldn't understand why my dad didn't want me hanging out with the nice man that gave me lollipops and let me ride on his tractor. Fast forward like 14 years, my family and I are watching TV one night when the man's face flashes across the screen. He had taken the lives of 2 people and was now serving time in prison. And the worst part, he used pills on the people that he would call his lollies. People now think there's drone footage that confirms that this ghost is real. Oh my god. So since the 1980s, locals in Cannock Chase in the UK have claimed to see the ghost of a black-eyed little girl in the woods. Multiple witnesses have reported seeing a little girl with soulless black eyes and a crooked neck popping out of the woods. Some say she's searching for her mother, and others say that she feels demonic. But now reports are saying that a drone may have caught a photo of her. This is the image that was captured this week, and people are saying they think this is the girl. Here's a close-up image of it where you can see her hair, you can see her crooked neck, and you can see the black eyes. But what do you think? Is it her? Have you heard this scary radio transmission people have been hearing? So Mark Connolly was in Grand Rapids last week when he heard something strange come over his radio that interrupted the music he was listening to. He described it as a man's voice, but really low and just humming a simple tune that Mark had never heard before. It lasted like 3 seconds, but Mark said his dogs were freaking out when it came on. So Mark does what anyone does, and he goes to the internet where he finds a Reddit thread from 2010 of another woman saying that she heard the exact same thing he did. That was the only thread he could find on the entire internet of someone hearing exactly what Mark had heard, and no one had replied to her Reddit thread. He also noticed that she stopped posting 3 weeks after she reported hearing the noise, and she had been posting like a lot before that. But now when you look it up, like 4 people within the last week have heard this noise all throughout the Midwest. And still, no one knows what it is, but they all say that it comes over usually a car radio around 11:30 at night. I swear the creepiest stuff always happens in hospitals. So Katrina was a nurse in the pediatric oncology part of the hospital, and she was looking after this one little boy that was in rough shape. It seemed like his treatments weren't working anymore, but despite all this, he stayed in pretty good spirits. And he would always wear his Spider-Man costume. Like every day, always in the Spider-Man costume. Sadly, the little boy eventually passed away from his cancer. But then, a few months later, a teen boy gets admitted down the hall. And this was after the little boy had already passed away, so there was no overlap between the two. This boy was also in pretty rough shape and his treatments weren't working anymore. But then one night, a nurse hears him talking to someone inside of his room, but there's no one there. So the nurse goes in to see who he's talking to, and she can't believe what he says. The teen said he just saw a little boy dressed as Spider-Man in his room talking to him. And this little boy was telling him all about Marvel and all about how much he loves Spider-Man. The teen boy ended up passing away a few weeks later, but that story always stuck with the nurses.
Terrifying Christmas traditions you didn't know about.
The legend of Frau Perchta comes from southern Germany and Austria and says that you have to have a tidy home by January 6th or she's gonna come get you. If you haven't spun all your flax by January 6th, or basically cleaned up your entire home, Frau Percha will come to you in the middle of the night, disembowel you, and fill your body with rocks and straw. So instead of Elf on the Shelf this Christmas, why don't you just tell your children that if they don't behave, an evil Christmas witch will come and rip out their intestines? Frau Percha is typically depicted as having a long cane, a nose made of iron, she's dressed in rags typically, and she also carries a long hunter's knife under her skirt.
Some legends say that Perchta rides around the 3 Thursdays before Christmas with her evil army of lost souls. So if you hear the wind whipping around those nights, it's actually Perchta on her wild hunt. So Merry Christmas to all, and don't let the evil Christmas witch turn you into her own personal scarecrow.
We're taking a look at some of 2021's scariest ghost encounters. Follow along if you want to hear more. User El Hombre Molecular on Reddit claims that one night in 1991, him and his brother were playing when they heard a strange noise coming from upstairs. Thinking they woke up their father, they ran upstairs but found him sleeping peacefully in bed.
They turned to leave, but standing in the doorway behind them was an old man. Frail, completely gray hair, wearing a blue-collared shirt. They said that he looked like he was completely solid and not an apparition, yet he vanished after 3 seconds. The two were shaken and ran back to their rooms, but that's not where the story ends. The user claims that the scariest part of this whole encounter was the fact that this year, in 2021, their father looks exactly like the apparition that was in the doorway 30 years ago. So what do you think? Was that a vision of the future, or just a scary coincidence? It's been 25 years since JonBenét Ramsey died, and we still don't have any answer as to who did it, but I want to talk about the weirdest part of the case. This ransom note was found inside the house before they found JonBenét in the basement, and it's just written unlike any normal ransom note would have been written. First of all, it's written on her mom's stationery with her mom's pen, and it's 3 pages long, which means that the person or people were in the house for a while writing this note before they went to go kidnap JonBenét. Most ransom notes are like 2 sentences. We have your daughter, we want this much money. Super to the point. But this one's really rambling and doesn't make a lot of sense. It also starts out with using "we are a group of individuals," but then by the end they're saying like, "I will call you tomorrow," like using I statements. So it's really unclear who actually is writing the letter. And then it's also asking for $118,000, which is a really low amount and a very specific amount of money, which kind of suggests that the person doing this knew the Ramsey family really well or had like a specific thing that they needed that exact amount of money for. One of the leading theories right now is that the parents actually wrote the note, that something maybe happened that night and JonBenét accidentally died. They freaked out and wrote a ransom note as if, it was some sort of botched home invasion. The note ultimately was not written in their handwriting, which police have, it's basically inconclusive, but they believe it was not written in their handwriting, so that theory doesn't really hold up, but it's still just really confusing as to who would have done that. It's been 25 years, and this is one of those cases we might never actually know what really happened. People have come forward and confessed, but they've always been not the person that did it. So, I don't know. I think that the answer really is in the ransom note that was left, if it can be decoded and figured out who actually left it. But until we get some clarity on this note, I really don't think we're going to figure out who did it.
Do you believe in time travel? So in the early 20s, a teacher by the name of Paul Dyanak fell into a coma that lasted an entire year. Upon awaking, Paul wouldn't tell anyone what the experience of being in a coma was like, but he started feverishly writing it down in a journal. According to Paul, if anyone really knew what he saw, it would land him in a mental hospital. It wasn't until years later after his death that one of his friends actually read his journal and found out exactly why that was. So according to Paul, when he fell into this coma, he actually woke up in the body of a man in the year 3906. This was a man who actually died in a motor vehicle accident and was revived as Paul. While he was in the future, he claims to have read many books to figure out what was going on, and these are some of the things that he realized. He said that Mars was colonized by people in 2204, but in 2265 a huge disaster struck that actually killed all 20 million people living on the planet. Apparently also a war is going to break out in 2309 that's going to destroy most of civilization, but by 2396 there's going to be like a spiritual golden age for all of the earth. There's a lot more to this story, but I think my favorite part is just the fact that he didn't want to be famous for this. He didn't ever publish his journal or really want anyone to know that this happened to him, so I don't know, what do you think? While we're on the subject of time travelers, let's talk about Eleanor Jourdain and Charlotte Mobley. In 1901, Charlotte and Eleanor claimed to have experienced a time slip while out for a walk in the gardens of Versailles. During a regular stroll in the gardens, the women had found themselves in an unknown area. They had crossed a rustic bridge to get there and passed a plow that they had never seen before. Not only was this area new, but the women claimed nothing in the environment seemed familiar. There was like a dark cloud that felt like it was sinking over them, and there were people in weird clothing, and a band was playing music that they had never heard before. After this walk, the women were never able to find this part of the garden again, and actually this part of the garden may not have had existed in hundreds of years. See, when they asked where the plow was, a groundskeeper told them that the plow had not been there since the French Revolution, when Louis XVI had sold it. And as for the old bridge they passed, that hadn't been there in over 100 years. See, that bridge was used by Marie Antoinette in the late 1700s. It had been demolished decades ago. One of the strangest parts of this story was that Charlotte actually saw a woman in the garden that day and was never able to identify who it was until a year later when she saw this portrait of Marie Antoinette. See, most portraits of Marie Antoinette show her with a much slimmer nose and a longer face. But one of Marie Antoinette's closest confidants actually said that this portrait was the one that looked the most like Marie. The two women published their story, and skeptics immediately came up with a bunch of reasons as to why this was untrue. From maybe there was a reenactment happening that day that the two women stumbled upon, to maybe they were hallucinating because of their lesbian tendencies. So yeah, obviously this one does seem like very hard to believe, but the idea of time slips are really interesting and there actually might be something to them. What do you think? This photo is supposedly proof of time travel. This picture was taken in 1941 at a Canadian bridge opening, but a lot of people think that this guy right here looks way too modern to be of that time. I mean, to be fair, he does look like he plays backup guitar in Death Cab for Cutie. He has this cardigan over what looks like a graphic tee, and he's even wearing these like modern sunglasses and has this tiny little Kodak camera like every boy that hurt me in college. So did this guy enter a wormhole at a Father John Misty concert, or is he just a modern man of his time? Most signs point to the latter. So he's not really wearing a graphic tee, he's actually wearing a jersey for the Montreal Marooners, which was a hockey team from the 20s and 30s. His sunglasses seen here are also from the time, but they just weren't in fashion and not many people wore them. Referenced here by the fact that no one is wearing them. So he might not be a modern day hipster, but he is wearing a sports jersey ironically, and he didn't brush his hair, so I think he would still make you listen to his vinyl and then never call you back. Let's talk about that family in Kentucky that had completely blue skin. In 1975, Benjamin Stacy surprised doctors when he was born with entirely blue skin. No one really knew what was going on until his grandmother said that her grandmother was also completely blue, and that actually a lot of her family members had been blue. See, Benjamin was actually part of the Fugate family, which had the recessive gene which was able to flourish in his bloodline due to inbreeding. Unfortunately, throughout history, inbreeding has been fairly common, creating a lot of genetic traits that we actually know about today, such as this Habsburg jaw, which is a devastatingly protruding underbite that was really popular in the German-Austrian royal family. Inbreeding also may have helped hemophilia flourish, which is the inability to form blood clots, seen here starting with Queen Victoria, but then also winding up with Alexei in the Russian Tsar family at the early 1900s. So the blue people of Kentucky was not a myth, it was not an urban legend, it was not even a medical mystery, it was just due to generations of inbreeding, due to there not really being a lot of people in the area at the time. Benjamin eventually stopped being blue, but he still carries the recessive gene, which means if he were to breed with someone who also carried the recessive gene, there's a chance that his offspring could carry on that gene for generations. I don't really know how to end this video other than saying, please don't breed with your family members. Have you heard about how everyone on Earth has supposedly had the same nightmare? A website in 2006 claims that everyone on the planet has dreamt of this man, but that this man doesn't actually exist. He's someone that we've all collectively made up. Andrea Nutella, the creator of the website, said that the man came to him in a dream and told him to make the website to help figure out his true identity. But after posting about him and hearing thousands of other people's stories about dreaming of this man, he was never identified. There were a few theories, however, that arose as to who this man could be, including a representation of God, a corporation that had subliminally been conditioning us to dream of him, and that people actually only were dreaming of him after hearing about him from other people, meaning he was spreading like a virus. The internet immediately went crazy with this story, and everyone was trying to figure out who this man could be, or even if people had actually been dreaming of him. Eventually, Nutella came forward and admitted that this whole thing had been a publicity stunt, but he never said exactly what he was marketing, so a lot of people believe that maybe he had to disappear to cover up the story he was reporting on. So even though we might not have all dreamt the same face, it's not uncommon for people to share similar themes in their nightmares, such as being trapped by water and even dreaming of your teeth falling out. So what do you think? Have you seen his face in your nightmares?